Right, so now, here we are today. See, this is a genuine question. I talked to Susan Glasser about it earlier this week. I don't know how to deal with it because Donald Trump goes out and does a speech, and his speeches are just wheels off nonsense, and he does election fraud stuff every time, which is not true. He does January 6th apologia now, every speech. He lies about Joe Biden.
Not just apologia. He starts his rallies with January 6th criminals singing the national anthem, and he calls them hostages at a time when there are actual American hostages in Gaza. Yeah, no, it's you're downplaying it.
I'm going to play more from where that came from in just a second, but first, to add a little context, Mediaite reports on this. CNN anchor Jake Tapper couldn't contain his disgust, rightfully so, when podcast host Tim Miller accused ex-President Donald Trump of January 6th apologias, saying Miller was downplaying Trump's shocking antics. Tapper was a guest on this week's episode of the Bulwark podcast to promote his CNN series, United States of Scandal. And before I add my analysis to this, here is the rest of that exchange.
Okay, thank you. So there you go. So there's that. He's cheering on the insurrectionists. He's lying about Joe Biden constantly, and you can just go through the list, lying about the economy and the crime, and like the kinds of stuff that if Jeb had said, like, "Oh, crime is up," when crime is down, there would have been a fact checked about us, and we would have had to apologize, right? Like that stuff doesn't even get mentioned. But if you do the lead every day and talk about the crazy stuff that Trump said, then, Republicans will come on and say, Jake, you're so biased, right? How do you deal with it? Like in this day and age, how do you deal with Trump every day lying and the premise of his campaign really being a lie?
So first of all, I'm not afraid of being called biased, and I get called that by the left and the right all the time, period, full stop. I do think that the way that we cover Trump is something that takes thought and care, because I don't know that it achieves anything to come on. It's Chris Cillizza does this great thing on his Substack, which is, the 50 craziest lines from Donald Trump's speech last night, or the 30 craziest lines from his interview with Howie Kurtz last night, or whatever, and he does. And it's always a great read. But I don't think a TV version of that would be of service to my viewers. I think when he says something that is shocking and new, it is worth discussion, like I did yesterday with his comment that any American Jew who votes for Democrats, and Jews vote for the Democratic Party about 70% of the time, roughly, hates their religion, hates Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves, which is an empirically false statement. I know plenty of progressive Jews or Jewish Democrats who love Israel and love their religion. I'm even related to a few of them. And two, shocking is the nicest thing I can say. So we covered that. I covered it. We had a discussion with Frum and Crystal. We covered it. It's not like I don't cover it, but I'm not going to hand over my show to Donald Trump.
So it's such an interesting conversation that I want to dive into. And I criticize a lot the way that the media doesn't properly cover Biden's presidency when talking about the achievements in his record, or doesn't properly go through the threat that Trump poses to democracy. But I understand why this is a really difficult subject because of all the different elements at play within it. And before getting to that, of course, this started with the correction from Jake Tapper about Trump's celebration of the January 6th rioters. And I do want to remind you of the moment they're referring to from a recent Trump rally, a new thing he does at the beginning of rallies.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the horribly and unfairly treated January 6th hostages.
So again, as I said in a past segment when originally covering that, he's now saluting, for some reason, the January 6th quote unquote hostages, as he calls them. A wildly inaccurate and vile term to use for individuals who stormed the Capitol, who violated the law, and are now being held accountable legally for it. They were the party of law and order until individuals try to block the certification of a free and fair election violently, then law and order's out the door and they celebrate those individuals. And given what they did, given what they stood for, it's wild that using the national anthem, this is now a defining characteristic of the MAGA movement, especially given they used to be like, oh, it's so horrible what's being done when it comes to the national anthem with Kaepernick, and that's disgracing the national anthem. But now we're going to honor those who attacked the Capitol, tried to block the peaceful transfer of power, tried to block the certification of an election, tried to block the Constitution from proceeding, and they're going to be honored during the national anthem. That's a disgrace to the national anthem. Now, back to the point that was touched on in Jake Tapper's conversation there with Tim Miller after the January 6th writers one. It is really difficult, especially for these big mainstream outlets, to decide how to and to contend with daily the coverage of Donald Trump. And that's something I absolutely understand, even when I'm very critical of the mistakes in that coverage. And the reason is, yes, they're going to get accused of being biased every which way. And covering Trump as urgently and existentially as he should be covered will get you accused of being too liberal, even when that's the accurate, fact-based way to discuss him. But also, you don't want your viewers to only be informed on one subject, right? So they do have to cover different things. And Jake Tapper said at the end of the clip that he doesn't want to cede his show to the Trump stuff 24/7, just giving his show over to the topic of Trump. But when in a political moment, one individual represents the greatest threat to our democracy that we faced in generations, then you gotta cover him a lot. And I would say that right now the media falls too much on the side of not doing, again, urgent enough, stark enough, blunt enough coverage often enough of Donald Trump. So if they're wrong in a direction, it's not doing enough of that sort of coverage and making sure people understand that he poses an existential threat to our democracy. But again, it is a difficult balance, including because, in a sense, discussing 24/7 every crazy thing Trump says and does serves him in this really distorted way, which is that if everything Trump does, according to a media outlet, is crazy, then the viewers get a little numbed out to it. And we've seen this. One of the things that really dangerous, dishonest, sort of authoritarian leaders, one of the ways they can break the media's ability to hold them accountable is to flood the zone with lies, flood the zone with feces. And as someone said, I can't remember, I'm quoting someone, to make it to where any individual lie, any individual crazy act just doesn't shock people, doesn't move people or motivate people to get out there and work against that person, because it's so common and it all just becomes background noise. Yeah, Trump's doing something crazy. And we've seen that, where Republicans can get away with defending Trump by saying, Trump says a lot of stuff, whatever. Oh, he called for termination of the Constitution. He says a lot of stuff on social media. Because surround sound coverage of the craziness can numb people out. But does that mean you don't cover it? I don't think so. So then what's the answer? Because I'm sort of explaining both ends there. I think the proper way to do this is always contextualize. Contextualize everything. And that plays a role in two settings. The first being, when you do cover the crazy things, add the context of why it is so dangerous. Don't just go, that's crazy, moving on. Because then people do get numbed out to, Trump says something, it's crazy, next thing. And really explain. That's why some of you have heard the same rant about the broader context of how Trump tried to block the peaceful transfer of power, the things he said since then about a second term, so that you understand it's not just a guy who says a lot of crazy things, it's a guy who could end democracy, and here's exactly how and why his record indicates that could happen. So that context has to be added. And I think people in the media assume that people get it. We talked about that already. And I take issue with, on that, one thing that Jake Tapper said. He said it has to be shocking and new to be discussed. I get the shocking element because you can't cover every single thing that Trump does all the time. Otherwise, you are just the Trump show. But new, this is why people forget. People don't know. They just don't know about the details of how Trump tried to block the peaceful transfer of power. The amount of people who don't know what the fake elector scheme was, for example, or they don't know exactly what Trump was trying to get local officials to do, or they don't know that allies of Trump breached a voting site. They don't, etc. And that's because I think a lot of people in the media assume, we talked about that. We covered it when it happened. It has to be shocking and new. So we're going to move on. And then people are not informed on exactly why it is that Trump threatens democracy, because he's shown us his willingness to end it, which is what would have happened if all those schemes had worked in 2020, and 2021. Then the other way, you have to add context. So to be clear, always put into the conversation the context of the broader characteristics of Trump as a dangerous figure. And that applies to other subjects, not just threatening democracy. The other way is, I think, of course, you have to talk about other things. While, yes, Trump poses this existential threat and thus he has to be talked about a lot, people want to be informed on other subjects too from news outlets. And so they have an obligation to inform people on those too. And if you're talking about politics, which someone like Jake Tapper does, then I think it's also always layering over any conversation the context of often what the contrast is between the two sides, right? So if you're covering something that is related to Joe Biden and you just have to talk about his new sneakers that help to prevent stumbles, or you just have to talk about a poll about the concern around his age, even though there's been 10 billion stories about that and I don't understand the obsession, but let's just say you just feel like you got to, then your obligation is to add the context of, and let me remind the viewers, the election is going to be between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And let's just walk through real quickly what Donald Trump stands for, what he said in recent weeks, what he tried to do when he was president last time and trying to block the peaceful transfer of power, his call for determination of the Constitution, his promise that the government will go after media outlets he doesn't like if he got a second term, etc. Civilly liable rapists. Just throw in the context to understand the contrast between the two different candidates here. And then I think you're starting to get to a proper coverage of such an unprecedented moment. But again, the fact that so many outlets are getting that wrong, are overemphasizing unimportant things, and when doing so, not providing the context of the broader outlook, and are forgetting to re-emphasize really important things when it comes to Trump and his movement, even though it aggravates me to no end, I don't think it's necessarily a bad faith effort or has malicious intentions. I just think it's really difficult to apply typical media rules to a moment that's anything but typical. And by the way, I did ask Don Lemon during our recent interview about this sort of messed up coverage, about the way that fear of being accused of being biased can cause the media to apply two different standards in their coverage of Democrats versus Republicans, or this story versus that story. And I'll remind you of how that back and forth went. Do you feel like that fear of being accused of being biased can affect the coverage of things and make it to where there's two different standards that politicians are being held to, or two different standards of coverage?
Here's what I will say. The right, they are experts. They're much better than the left at messaging, right? With slogans, right? Build a wall, or, liberal bias, or that sort of thing. So they're very good at messaging. And I think sometimes, mainstream news organizations or, legacy news organizations, they allow themselves to be defined by their critics and by their detractors. And that's not good. And so I think you're right that they can be overreactive, and they try to overcorrect because people will say that the mainstream media is biased or liberal when you're just presenting facts. That was particularly difficult during the Trump administration, because there were so many lies coming out of not only the president's mouth, but the people around him. And that's just fact. And so by stating that, they will define you, and they used to define me as left-leaning or liberal just for saying the president of the United States is lying. This, he lied on this. He did this. This was wrong. The way he handled this was, untraditional, right? From the way that a president, they will take that to say, see, look at their liberal bias when it's just factual. And I think that news organizations, in my opinion, should not be concerned with that, whether they're left or right. They should be concerned with the truth. The truth is not left or right. It is the truth. And so I think that when you're in a position, meaning an administration or a subject or whatever, where the truth is not on your side, it is very easy. The easiest way the easiest thing that you can do is to attack the messenger, right? And I often think that the media falls for that. So they shouldn't be worried about people attacking them on the right. Just state the facts and move on, and that's it.
Yeah, so he was willing to admit that indeed that happens. The fear of being accused of being liberal then causes messed up priorities and coverage. And then we get these sort of obsessions over Biden's age while the guy on the other side's running an openly authoritarian campaign. Or really, the scale's whacked out in how we're prioritizing things, for sure. And hopefully, as these conversations continue here and obviously elsewhere, that can start to change. If you want to watch the full interview, by the way, with Don Lemon, I'll put it on screen there. And make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to become a member to get the daily bonus show, you can do so by going to lukebeasleyshow.com/membership.